heard a little bit about the physical nature. We heard a little bit about the institutional nature. How many of you actually did what we asked you to do at lunch and talked about what you're being successful at and what your challenges are? Raise your hand if you actually did it. A little bit, okay. So this is the part of the late afternoon before touring and drinking and eating that we have an open conversation in the room. So my job is to help you talk about what the challenges are first. We'll do the pity party of the session first, and then we'll talk a little bit about where we're being successful. So we travel the country all the time, our team, and are talking to communities. And actually on the way back from Williamsburg today, I was talking with one of our guys on what are the themes we just heard. We just did listening sessions, so I'm going to jump in on some of it, but I want to hear somebody here who, what are the big challenges you're dealing with in your communities, or if you're a funder, or if you're somebody else, what are you dealing with that you hear as themes regularly? And this is the talking part, so you got to jump in. Raise your hand. There we go. You can stand up too.
So we deviated just a little bit, of course. Your conversations tend to do that. And one of the things we were discussing is in regards to small business and entrepreneurship, access to capital, and some of the barriers within that being, of course, student debt and healthcare. It's very, very difficult to change jobs or not change jobs if you're caught up in wanting to keep your health care. And so I don't know that we came up to answers, but that's something we certainly identified as a challenge, especially when you're talking about trying to help people who don't necessarily have a lot of money, but they have great ideas and they have great potential. How do you help them get access to capital?
So Brooklyn, I've been all over the state of North Carolina in the last 2 months hosting regional sessions to learn what are the barriers and assets in the different regions in the state. And the two, I think, barriers that we've heard the most are access to affordable and quality broadband and housing. And what's interesting is that those are the top two issues in both rural and urban and suburban areas. Most people think of broadband as just a rural issue, and most people think of housing as an urban issue, but actually both places are dealing with both issues, and we need some strategies to figure out how to tackle both of those.
Anybody else having trouble with housing these days? We hear it a lot. What specifically, what are you dealing with?
So in Wilson, we don't have necessarily a problem with having a lot of housing. We have a problem with quality, affordable housing. We have a lot of affordable housing that's just largely not quality affordable housing. And so that's a huge problem in Wilson, and anyone who works in this field at all knows that in North Carolina, the whole landscape for funding and financing for housing, affordable housing, has changed dramatically over the last 15, 20 years, and it's just really hard to do, whether you're on the private side or you're on the public side. So they're just tools that used to exist that basically don't exist anymore, and especially if you're not in entitlement community, CDBG entitlement community from the municipal side, we have this problem in Wilson. There's really no money for it.
So let me throw a wrinkle on it. Well, one of the things we're hearing from smaller communities is that they can't get new housing, and if they don't have new housing, they can't attract millennials because they don't like those old housing styles. Doesn't have a walk-in closet, doesn't have an ensuite bathroom, doesn't have hardwood floors and granite tops. Anybody noticing that housing's having an impact on your ability to attract new people to your community? Yeah, here. It's easy.
I would say we're having just the opposite problem. The millennials are the ones that are attracted to our spaces like this, with the raw brick exposed and the natural hardwood floors and the duct piping being visible. And so being able to utilize that interest and convert upper floor commercial buildings to attract the millennials has been really successful for us. Where we're challenged is the large historic homes that surround downtown. They're not so interested in having a 5,000 square foot home and a big yard to maintain. With lots of paint that has to be done every 5 years, for these stick-built homes. So that's where our challenge is finding a niche for those larger single-family homes that we want to save because of their historic value and what helps make us unique.
How expensive or not is it to renovate some of the downtown stuff?
It's very expensive, but there are a lot of tools out there. If you have people that understand the tools that are available, you can help navigate that environment for a potential investor. The historic preservation tax credits, which we were very successful this year, and making sure that they're still available for the next 4 years at the state level, has been a huge asset for us in making those projects happen.
Anybody else on housing? Yep. I'll work off my cookie. Clark set a standard.
In Great Falls, we're at the very beginning of our process, and we have a lot of mill village housing. And we visited Cramerton, North Carolina, and Saxpahaw, and saw the potential for those mill villages to really be attractive housing. And so the challenge for us is to develop the ordinances and the planning process to preserve that atmosphere the mill village housing has. And we've seen that it's attractive to millennial buyers.
On it. Cramerton's interesting because a lot of very small mill housing was a community in Mill Town. When I was in Horicon just 2 weeks ago, John Deere told me they were going to start rebuilding their own housing. And they were going to use the same lots that they used in the 30s to build their housing. But they'd sold them all, now they're buying them all back. And they're going to start building housing again because they can't get developers to come into the community to build their housing, and they've got open manufacturing jobs they can't get anyone to fill. What about broadband? Is that common to people? Is it availability? Is it cost? Is it what? Availability? We're hearing in some places, even if they run the lines, that a lot of lower income people are not choosing to sign up, that they're bypassing it with phones. Anybody else hearing that now? Okay, we're seeing that around the country because there's been some rural grants to extend broadband into some rural areas, some smaller areas, but the take-up rate's not as high as we go forward. Is that what you were? Yep.
So a question I wanted to ask the panel earlier today, and I'm Sarah Hall from NC State, was as we're doing community development, we heard from a couple of different examples, what work at all is happening around digital literacy in your communities to help grow the community and get them more involved in the work that you're doing? So specifically digital inclusion, so we talked about access, the actual computers, but then also leveraging that technology for community growth and economic development. Kimberly.
So this is just one small thing, but in Wilson we do own our own broadband system, municipally owned broadband. And so the broadband does run to every property in the entire city when anyone who's almost anyone who's a Wilson Energy customer, and we also own the all the utilities basically. And so in anyone who is in one of the housing authority houses, lives in a housing authority unit, gets broadband for $10 a month. So again, they would have to sign up for it, but we do subsidize that greatly to try to have some effect at least on that digital divide. So. Cost.
Yeah, I mean, nationally it's cost. Because even, just presume you know what you pay. There's a bunch of people who can't afford what you pay, even if you've got it to your front door. So it's an issue. Wilson is very unusual in the state, by the way, with owning their own utilities. That's not the norm here for a lot of places. I'm sorry? And no longer possible in the state legally, that's correct. Yes, one of those rules. What other subjects did you talk about at your lunch meeting as challenges?
We talked a little bit about getting the new workforce, and I know some of you have talked about workforce today, getting people who are interested in being an entrepreneur if they will take that risk. They've got ideas, but they're not, I guess it's too easy to work for a big company who offers lots of benefits and but just getting younger people to take a risk to be an entrepreneur.
Do we find the next generation to be more risk averse or not? I mean, they went through, the people were talking about the next, Michael, you're talking about the next generation being, you know, but they saw the last downturn. That's their formative event in their life. A lot of people think the next generation are the ones that are going to stay at the job longer and do that kind of stuff. Is that what y'all are seeing? Some of y'all are them, so y'all can answer that too. So it's all right.
I would say, again, we're involved in real estate, so we're out looking for tenants all the time. And so we have a good number of startups that we work with. I'd say the challenge in them, and that's what when I work with community, like in the ABC Center in East Durham, try to invite the community to get involved, is to say, folks, the bricks and mortar part is the start. Now, if when this pharmacist or this childcare or these different organizations move into your community, you have a vested interest in participating and helping them succeed, because when they succeed, again, we all succeed. And so, you know, because again, sometimes in this work, you know, before it starts, people are maybe complaining about what they don't have. And then you provide what they have in the way of the tenants, and then you don't support them, and sometimes as well as you should. So in other words, people have got to feel like they're involved in, you don't solve the problem until the folks are successful. So so I think the help that's necessary is on the marketing side. Quick story, but we're in Greensboro, we were involved, we acquired a shopping center. The city wanted to, you know, I mean, when it's vacant, it's off the tax book, so to speak, city owned it. So we got involved in the Renaissance Center in Chapel Hill. There was a movement that invited us in where they wanted to have a co-op, a food co-op as the anchor tenant in that shopping center. Well, running a grocery, it's almost like trying to put Whole Foods in an urban neighborhood. You know, fresh food is a whole lot more expensive. It's a thin margin industry, and so there are a lot of folks that bought memberships but didn't shop there. And so in other words, when working with startups and entrepreneurs, you got to figure out how you're going to drive the customers and who to the business. Otherwise, it is an exercise in frustration, because most businesses fail.
Think so?
So in Virginia, they have a program through the state called the Community Business Launch. And it's a great model that you can, even if you don't take part in the grant or are lucky enough to be able to receive one of those grants, is basically, it's a boot camp. It starts off with a 6-week boot camp, and it's very partnership and collaboratively driven. So we've got SBDC, our local college involved. We've got partners through the Institute. We partner with the city. We partner with the state. We partner with the chamber, some of the local financial institutions. And what we do is we have subject matter experts, and for 6 weeks, you learn a different component of how to own your own business, from business planning to marketing to research to credit repair, the legals, the accounting. And if you complete all of those classes, you can then pitch for funding for your business. And so what we found there is the first time we did it, we had 75 people register for these free classes. And the idea behind it is, no, you're not probably going to have 75 people that want to start a business, but it begins to plant the seed. And it begins to show people that this big, scary entrepreneur word, which that in itself can be a barrier to people who are interested in maybe owning their own business, that it can be accessible. And, you know, we learned a lot from that. You had people who needed to sharpen up their math skills. You know, you had people who were way beyond that, and they needed a completely different level of assistance. But we had people already lined up to mentor them and to help them with that. And so what we found is we were able to open 4 businesses, open 2 new businesses, and expand 2 businesses out of that. But it was so well received in the community that there are people that said, yeah, I want to open my business. I don't want any of your money. But yeah, I'm going to now go on and open my own business. And we didn't care whether through that process they opened their business in the River District or not. Of course, we wanted them in the River District. But the end-all be-all is wherever you open your business, you're going to be a important part of the economics in your community. And so if there's ever an opportunity to just provide education, that's just a great place to start. And again, RDA couldn't do that. We had to do it with about 10 other partners. That was the only way it was possible. But I think a lot of times, if you've got a great idea and you have no idea where to go, what to do, where to start, just offering some basic classes, even if there's not a pitch behind it, is a great place to start. The other great part of that was we identified a block that we wanted to activate. And that's where, if you won the pitch, you would agree to try to locate at least somewhere in the district. And so it also helped with the property development side of things, because we could go talk to property owners and say, we have somebody that potentially we're doing this competition that may be able to move into your space and try to spur some development that way as well. So it takes a village, literally. I know that's an old saying, but I think just breaking down the barriers of cost, accessibility, and feeling welcome, that went a long way actually towards getting that going. And now we're doing the second one without the state grant money, so it worked out well.
Yeah, go back here and then I'll pop up to you, Michael.
So Michael mentioned the American Underground, and so it's huge in Durham. And so we were like, well, we should get the entrepreneurs together in Rocky Mount. It'd be really great. And another organization tried to do a co-working space, flopped. We talked about getting the entrepreneurs together. Nobody showed up. Somebody said to me once, well, I'm just not in the tech industry. Well, I'm not into software. All of a sudden it was like, wait a minute. Entrepreneurs aren't just in the tech industry. Maybe we're marketing it wrong. Maybe we're talking about it wrong. And so even though there are a lot of classes and panels, we started just saying, what about a small business owner? If you're a small business owner, maybe that's who we're talking to. And so instead of, obviously our end goal would be to have some of these businesses move into the mill, but even bigger than that, and going back to this 50-year timeline, is a lot of these are the folks that we want to invest in our community in 25 years. And they're the ones that we want recruiting other people to come and be part of the community. And so if we can help them be established and network between themselves, then in the long run, it's going to help everybody. So we started with this small business owners group. And I mean, these guys can attest to it. It's more like a support group now. But what you see is how it's grown. Like Kevin from Lorema, Jessica have been involved in this basically since they've opened their businesses. And so when they have a ribbon cutting or they have a big event, everybody turns out for it. And you start seeing that over and over again on social media, and all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, there's lots of new stuff happening in Rocky Mount. Look at that, that person looks like me. Or that person started where I did. And my favorite story from this is we had our first meeting and had everybody talking about their challenges, and this is what they're dealing with. And one woman said, that's all well and good, but let me tell you what it's like to start a business over 50. And this other one was like, yes, that is what I don't hear, is how do I, as a woman over 50, start my business? It is more exhausting, on and on. So that, to me, has really been something that in the long run will help everybody, because they see each other in their businesses. And that, instead of just calling it a tech entrepreneur or the underground or the co-working space, they themselves start talking about what they need. And as the ones who can sort of provide the real estate, we're just listening. And we're able to be there to say, okay, well, when the time's right, then maybe we'll be able to kick off that whatever space it is that turns out to be the space that everybody needs.
Okay. I was going to.
You want to give it back or not? Okay.
Yeah, so this is on two sides. So on the real estate side, we had vacant space that we just couldn't find the right use for. We'd seen several businesses come through it and nothing really was sticking. And so we just kept trying to figure out what to do. And then on the social side, we were seeing businesses that were testing new models or trying to go from a food truck to real estate. Was that the right move? And what we've done is open up one of the spaces at American Tobacco, and on a monthly basis, there is a new business for 1 month that pops up in there, and to test whatever it is they're doing. And it doesn't have to be just food oriented; it can be most anything. And from that, we've seen real estate, bricks and mortar come out of that. We've seen businesses grow their food truck business or move into other parts of the city as a result of these really quick 1 month. And from a real estate point of view, it keeps you active and relevant and new, so people constantly want to keep coming back.
And in Durham, we have a small business advisory committee. Durham City has a small business advisory committee. Well, basically all your technical advisor kind of organizations, we meet and talk and that sort of stuff. So informally, people get kind of passed around or referred around through that process. And then the other advice that I would give to entrepreneurs, and interestingly enough, the example I was going to give just walked in the door, and that's Nicole Oxendine. But what I tell young startup entrepreneurs is, establish a board early on that brings skill sets to, and you may know your product or your service well, but it's, in other words, when you create the operating structure that's going to kind of carry you forward, then you've got to, you need advisors. And so having a board and people that you can bounce things off of, and people that are going to look ahead and coach you up as to, where with accounting and marketing and all that sort of stuff. So to me, that's, whether they take the advice or not is different, but I think that's great advice to offer a young startup.
So just to give you an idea, the hardest part is that the tablecloths stepped out, and if you run just a little too, okay.
So I've been really glad that a lot of people have been mentioning diversity. A challenge for me is I'm not seeing it reflected in the data. Maybe it's in the data and it's just not being highlighted. So going back to Ross's charts in the beginning, I'm wondering if there are indices that, just like number of small year companies and the effect that has on a community's development, are there indices that are looking at diversity in high wage jobs, diversity in new companies, and the effect that has on a community? As someone mentioned earlier at the panel, we know now that when a company has more diverse leadership, the company makes more money. And also companies that are more diverse, more of their income comes from innovation alone than from comparison companies. And everything we're talking about today is innovation. So is there an index that is even looking at this? And also, something we know is that, for instance, just looking at gender diversity, if you're looking at a crowd of people in a movie, it can be overwhelmingly male, and generally people perceive it as a mixed crowd. The tipping point of females in a group for people to start thinking it's a 50-50 balance group, it's incredibly low. So just a few women in a crowd and people think like, oh yeah, that's a gender diverse group. So if you're not collecting data on that, you're telling yourself that, oh, we're mixed. So when we talk about, okay, we realize now that diversity is important, is it being measured? Is it being counted? And a challenge that we talked about in our small towns is there's a divide between from here, moved here. And that is, if your definition of diversity is not incredibly robust, you can really leave out the people that have kept your town going before you got there. You can have a racially, ethnically, education diverse panel and group and board of directors, and not a single one of them grew up in the town. And we wonder why people are resentful and don't want to come to the things we build. Well, we built it without them while congratulating ourselves that we're diverse. And even then, that diversity might be 1%, and we're saying, good job. So.
First, I want to thank you for everything you just said. I think it's really important, especially when we're talking about, so I grew up in Rocky Mount, I own a business here, and a lot of times when people are talking about millennials, it turns into this weird thing that's not real. Like we talk about any group of people. I mean, I'm in marketing, and as you study data for the demographic that you're trying to target, there's a ton of data out there for millennials, as there is for baby boomers and Gen Xers and everything. And I think just the way we approach it is just flawed. And so in communities, the reason you're seeing a lot of shifts, and there's a lot of data to back this up, that younger people are going to larger urban environments to take risk is because they feel like they can take the risk there. And I think that's part of what we're missing in these conversations in small towns. If it's not visible where the support system is, if it's not visible where the access points are, and if we haven't adapted the way we do business to engage those different demographics, I don't think you'll ever see it. I'll give you a really good example. Most of the meetings and discussions around these type of things happen at times that the majority of the people you're talking about can't even attend it. And just those kind of intentionality tactics, you could see a real big shift. It just takes intention. And I think you have to step back and ask yourself, what are you doing to really adapt the way you do business to actually reach those demographics, to have them at the table? And to me, it's just the same way a business goes after a client that they want. And to Evan's point about the entrepreneur group, I think that was a really good example, because what you see, every city or town typically has some kind of small business or entrepreneur group that's usually god-awful boring. Nobody wants to go to it. It's at some ridiculous time of the day. And the majority of the people in the room are not the examples that represent a lot of people. And that's not to knock anyone's work, but a young person starting a business is completely different from a business being handed down 5 generations. And a lot of small towns, that's a lot of your business leadership, and kudos and thank God for them. But you need to have people that can speak to the realism of what they're up against now. And I think that's just something you really need to be intentional about. And in our entrepreneur group, what was interesting, I didn't even want to do it at first. You know, Evan asked me about it. I was like, I don't want to go to that. But when we had the meeting, the thing that was fascinating was it just became the support system, and you felt like you weren't alone trying to build something or take a risk in a place where it seemed harder to do it. So I would just say you have to be intentional and change your tactics and strategies to make sure they match the demographic you're trying to target.
So our luncheon table actually had a local newspaper editor, which led into a sort of an interesting conversation about the role of local news, particularly in smaller communities. If you move beyond the social media, and you think about what traditionally was there, as in local newspapers, local radio stations, that kind of thing, how much they have shrunk. Many times in communities, there are no longer local newspapers, and if they are, they're owned by some very much larger syndicate. And so there's not an opportunity to really talk about what's going on in local places if you move beyond social media. And the rise of people like the Solutions Network, which is a group of the Solutions Journalism Network, which is a group of journalists looking at how you tell local stories, and how a lot of philanthropy is looking at how they can continue to support local media, which is very important in the storytelling.
Anybody? Yep. Let's see. Nope, you're good.
So many things one could say, such little time. But I wanted to comment on what you brought up and what we heard earlier, the wonderful question that this young woman asked earlier, that 21% of rural America right now, and we Durham doesn't really count in that. We've talked about Durham a lot, but we've got a lot of people here who are from rural places. 21% of rural America is people of color, but 83% of the growth from 2000 to 2010 in rural America was people of color, right? So this sort of like, what Michael was saying about don't wait until after you get started to think about, oh, how is what we're doing downtown going to benefit people of color? You got to do that right, or poor people, or whomever it is. The have-nots, whoever the have-nots are. And the have-nots could be older people, it could be people of color, it could be all kinds of, it could be the newcomers. But waiting, you know, the statistics we don't have, and you talk, the problem is we don't have a lot of statistics at a rural level. Census doesn't provide enough data at a granular level to do some of the measurement you're talking about. You got to do it yourself. So when we listen to Ross's statistics today, what we don't know is who, you know, those average wages, whose wages are those, right? Is it new people who came in who are taking the better jobs? What's happening to the people who are already there? So on some level, if you're really trying to make the people who aren't doing well do better, you got to figure out a baseline at the front end, right? Your own baseline at the front end, and figure out how are we going to, you know, and have people help you figure that out, you know, who want to do better. So what we've learned over years and years in the work we've been doing is that unless you ask the question at the front end of the design, it will not happen. If you're going to do economic development or community and economic development, you can come up with a lot of great stuff that's going to do wonderful things and make things look better and actually create jobs and businesses, but it may not help the people who aren't doing well in your community unless you design it in at the front end.
Thank you for that comment. I was just going to say, again, I mentioned that my rural area in Northampton County is about 45 minutes from here. We continue to have a population decline. We're teeny tiny, right, in Northampton County, 20,000 people, 25,000 in the whole county. But I don't have the facts to bear this out, but there are a lot of young retirees returning back to the area, including some of my family members who want amenities because they've lived in New York and places like that. Also to your point, even when I say about community, you have to define what does community mean where you are. And community should be inclusive. It's not just people who are native there, but what is this community as you are envisioning it to be that you're looking to serve? And again, thinking beyond what you might typically see in demographic data, because just anecdotally, I know I would venture to say 25% of my family members over 65 are now doing the reverse migration. We all did the great migration out to the big cities, earned the money, came back and living on the 10 acres fairly comfortably, but don't want to have to drive, 50 miles or whatever. So yes, to your...
Retirees are an important economic sector. Yeah, retirees are an important economic sector. Don Mackey, who's worked for years for the Center for Rural Entrepreneurship and now is at Network Kansas, he actually, when he does an economic analysis of a region or a place, he thinks of retirees as an economic driver because a lot of people who come to retire have established incomes, right? Either they actually were wealthy and they're moving rural because they want a better way of life and they've got a lot of money to spend, or they're on fixed incomes, but those incomes are reliable. So are you appealing to retirees or to people who are older? Are you creating a community for them too? Anyway.
Okay, get happy for a few minutes then, as you transition toward the happy hour. When you talked at lunch, what were you having success with? And if you're a community, talk about your community, but if you're a funder or a researcher, what are you seeing as being successful in smaller places around the country? Can't do this, you can't just be pity party. You got, I know you're in the South, but what's working?
So I live here in Rocky Mount. I was saying to some folks earlier that I really appreciate some of the young entrepreneurs that we do have. And it almost seems like maybe we've gotten to a tipping point where you have a few pioneers and they start a business and their friends come and see what they're doing and their former coworkers come and see what they're doing, and that brings more and that brings more. And so I'm really excited to see a really core group of folks who just bring so much new life and energy to the community.
That's sort of the goal, right? To get to that tip, that it starts looking like it's good. What else is working?
Some people have heard me say this, but I think one of the attractors that we have, if we're looking at ourselves in competition to the bigger cities, is that for people that are looking to see their fingerprint on something, you get to do that in our towns. You're in fill in the blank big city and you're starting a law firm, brewery, graphic design, whatever. You're just one of many. There's nothing new about that. There's nothing outstanding. It doesn't matter how creative you are. You're still one more of the creative class in that area. In these communities, you get to stand up and like shout from the mountaintops and everybody's going to hear you and see you.
We hear this a lot in communities and smaller places and community group work that we do, that millennials, you know, we like to type them, and I'm pretty good about not just throwing them all in a bucket and saying they're all like this. But what we hear a lot from young professional groups is we all want to make a difference. I don't want to do work that has no meaning. I don't want to be a cog in a machine that I don't know what the outcome is. And then they're in a city. They went there because of all the reasons people go to cities when they're 23. And at 28, they say, but 2 counties out, 3 counties out, this small place, I can make a difference. What I do there can actually matter. If I buy a house and renovate it in the old downtown, people notice. If I buy a house in the city, nobody pays any attention. If I start a business. So I think that's right. I think that actually we're seeing that millennials have that sort of need. Now, they also want their broadband. And somebody talked about, that everybody's got a co-working space that failed. Lots of communities can tell you that story. We hear a lot of communities also say, well, don't build co-working space. Build a third space. Make it a coffee shop, make it a brewery, make it a something. Put your money there. People will congregate wherever. It doesn't have to be a place to put a desk. It just has to be a place to get together and work. So we're seeing more of that transition. What else is working for people? That was a tentative hand. Is that tentative that you wanted to talk or tentative that it was working?
Tentative that I was going to talk instead of Janet because I'm wondering if she's hesitating, but you can chime in after. I think one of the things that we're seeing that's working is a report that Janet's group at the Aspen Institute just put out this week on rural development hubs, organizations that are working regionally across jurisdictions and across sectors to help multiple groups that are working more locally come together around common vision and fill gaps that are being left that aren't anybody's vision. And finding that working at that regional scale is incredibly important for having both the runway to be able to make bigger change and the collective influence to be able to influence higher level change. People talked a little bit about broadband solutions not being possible anymore, and I'm guessing that may be related to preemption. And so I don't know the story for Wilson in this state, but having broader influence up to state and federal change, for example, and even just having economic pull, leverage, and broader sustainability. So I would point folks to that Rural Development Hubs report that Janet and her team just put out this week. What's that? Oh, she has the executive summary here for everybody. And the other I will just highlight is a group of actually a handful of such hubs, regional CDFIs, have come together in a rural, oh my goodness, they just changed their name. and I can't remember what it is. It was the Persistent Poverty Working Group, and it's the rural. Do you remember? Anyhow, it's Hope, Enterprise Corporation, FAHI, First Nations, OESTA, CDC Brownsville, and RCAC have come together, and they're each individually working regionally, but have come together as a collective to work toward a common vision that unites their separate regions and also actually represents the racial diversity, the geographic diversity of our country in many ways, and have really taken a stand to say that together we have more in common than separate and then different, and are working to both influence policy change and also just influence how people are thinking about possibility, and to move out of a deficit mindset, thinking more about the future. So I would they also came out with a policy paper just last week. I would point you to both of those for some examples of bright spots.
Great.
I think there's one thing I've noticed growing up here. We've always had an issue with regional infighting, and that's a lot of things in rural communities that we don't talk enough about and we're not honest about. I travel a lot for my work, and I'll go to towns, and everybody will be like, I don't have any problem with the people of the town next door. Like, they've never met each other or, had a meeting together. But I'll say now, for the first time, we have a lot of new leadership at the chamber level, just having Ryan and Wilson and David Ferris here, Kate in Greenville. There's been a ton of work where they're actually regionally meeting together. There's a lot of work around workforce development, education, and things are progressing. The public, the challenge is making sure that message is being communicated out to the public, because I would say probably most of the rank and file of the community don't know these things, but being in the work and seeing it, there's a lot of positive things happening in Eastern North Carolina, and I'm really excited to see it. But I think it's because we have new leadership who don't have a lot of baggage and infighting with each other.
Thanks, Katrina. But I do have executive summaries of that for everybody and a few copies if you want any. But that's not. I got up to say two other things that I see working. One is for communities that are focused on child care. So we haven't brought it up today, but all around the country where I go, I hear business people saying it's an economic development crisis, the lack of child care, because people who want jobs can't get jobs because there's no one. So there are some rural communities that are getting very creative about how to develop child care centers, and they're finding it's attracting more families and then businesses and jobs. And so there's some really creative efforts out there. The other thing is place-focused, place-based impact investing. So what this is, think about community foundations, and we've heard about one today. Community foundations that are rooted in their place, and normally what they've been doing over the years is giving grants, right? But now they're looking at that 95% of their endowment that they don't give out at grants, but they invest it all the time. They invest it at, just like health legacy foundations, they invest it in, companies in China or whatever, and they're saying, hey, let's look at where that money's going, and can we take a portion of that money and use it to invest locally? And so there's a new growth movement in locally based foundations. They could be family foundations or health legacy or community foundations, to begin to figure out how do we invest some of that corpus locally. And even if it's 5%, it's a huge amount of money, especially in rural communities. So that's a real positive thing, and it's a source of great investments for some of the good ideas that you have.
Here, yeah. Let me go. Yep. Okay.
Thank you. First of all, Evan, I think, told you a lot about what's going on around here. You addressed the child care challenge. We're very fortunate in Rocky Mount with the Down East Partnership for Children. It is a national model to help direct and improve child care. Point in case was this past week, the state of Kansas sent 22 people here for 2 days to look at their model. So you're right. When we're bringing in businesses, just like right now we're in a transition team with DMV, childcare. And we have organizations like the Y, Down East Partnership for Children, to not only house those kids, but give direction about where to and where not to place your child. That's a real key part. As far as our relationships in this area go, right now, David touched on that just a moment ago. We have job openings in the next 18 months between 3,500 and 4,000 people. These are jobs coming into the Twin Counties and factor in retirement. Looking at Pfizer, which is our largest employer here with approximately 3,200 people, they have a lot of men and women that could walk out today with full retirement benefits. And that's in that. But also, we're looking at transportation. 18% of their workforce is out of the Triangle. Now, I'm going to go back to that 3,500. We're working with through RAMP East, R-A-M-P East. It's 8 community colleges throughout this area: Wilson, Nash, Edgecombe, Halifax, so forth, so on, Pitt. That's unprecedented, and it's a new model, and it's designed to train, because we're not going to fill those 3,500 jobs between Nash and Edgecombe County. We don't have that kind of unemployment or employable people here. It's got to come from other regions. These are the kinds of things that we're putting together and working on. Ryan and I and Kate spend a lot of time talking about working as a region. If Secretary Tony Copeland were here, he would tell you in a second, that these companies that are looking to relocate or expand, they don't know what the hell a county line is. They look at a region. So we work as a region, and I think that worked real well for the Triangle back in the 60s and 70s. But
so far, so good there. Anybody else? Success. Yep. Let me go back here in the view, or you want to start? On my way. I'll go on my way, okay?
One of the things I was just going to say is that somebody asked earlier, how do you find the talent in rural communities to do, good things? And I would say that it's already here. I don't think that's the problem. So when I look at places like Danville or Goldsboro or here in Rocky Mountain or in Wilson and lots of other rural communities, there are incredibly sophisticated projects going on that are very complex and really impactful for the community. So I do sometimes, somebody said something about getting the word out. Maybe that was David that said that. I talk to my friends in urban places, and they definitely have a sort of a mindset sort of against rural communities. Who, anybody do anything interesting there? Any smart people over there? But there really are, and we saw a lot of examples of it today. So maybe getting the word out, or getting some of those people to come and see what's going on in some of our communities, because there are some really, really fabulous high quality projects that happen in rural areas.
My comments kind of add on to what Kimberly just said. I think one of the powers that we have is that just a sense of desperation and the lack of resources. I was just at some retreat where an organization in my county has a $1.2 million advertising and marketing budget. My budget's $20,000, but I have over 11,000 followers on my Facebook page, and they have just close to 8,000. So I think it's just how you use your resources and leveraging them, be creative with them. And I think that sense of desperation, that lack of available, complete resources is really what creates, creative ideas and strategies to make that work for you. I mean, one of the things that we've done in the past year is partner with our travel and tourism department to provide the revenues to fund familiarization tours. So we entice bloggers and writers and people that are in the job of sharing your story across the state, and they come to your town for a day or two a you pay for them to have a good time, and then they go back and write about that experience from their point of view and their perspective, and that's so much more valuable and powerful than us telling you what you think and should think about our community. And so it's a really inexpensive way to do it, and I think, you know, social media and all that power that it has behind it is very inexpensive, but if you use it wisely, if you understand it, which I don't necessarily do, I just have somebody on my team that does, and I empower them to do it. So I think that's a great benefit for us.
Anybody else? So when we started doing Home of Future Thinking 3 years ago, the point was to create rooms that talk to each other. So that's why we do these type of things at the end of each session, is to have everyone have a chance to talk to each other in a group, but then also to talk to each other as the night goes on. So you have choices right now. Theoretically, you've made them already. So one of the choices is that there is a tour of town starting. Carly, bus not here quite yet, right? For the tour? I'm sorry, different bus. This bus here, if you're going back to the hotel, is ready to go. If you want to go, don't leave, nobody leave yet. I'm giving you your choices. This one goes back to the hotel. At 6 o'clock, it brings you back over here for cocktails and dinner starting at 6:30 in this building. So if you want to go back to the hotel, cool. If you're at the tiny house hotel, some of you, that's over there on the far side, and if you really need directions, just ask us about that, but that's walkable. Evan's going to do a tour of the campus. You've seen Evan in the back. That's not, you didn't sign up for that. So if you want to do that, you can walk back there and she will walk you around campus. That building over there, the white one that you can see, has 6 breweries and a bottle shop in it. It's open. Some of us may show up over there, right? 6? Brick building, sorry. Can't see the brick building from here. Right over there. Look for alcohol. It'll be there, I promise you. It'll be there. There might be some here when we finish that. Tonight, cocktail hour 6:30, dinner 7:15 here, and then after dinner, the buses will take you back to the hotel. So 2 choices for touring. Yes, you could start at the brewery. You might see me there along the way. Now, and then tomorrow morning we start back here. If you don't, we're not doing speeches tonight. So this is just spend time together. Start 7:30. Bus leaves the hotel at 7:15. If you need a ride, 7:30 back here for breakfast and tomorrow's content. Now that's a lot of logistics for a guy who's got notes. Anybody questions? Yes. Evan will do whatever you can convince Evan to do tomorrow, but go ride the blue bus, because actually Rocky Mount's great, the mill's great, but they've been building this community back place by place. There's a lot to see. So if you're on that, I would suggest you stay with it. All right, thank you. See you all back here.